Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to start in about 1 more minute, and I will be recording this meeting. And I have also disabled the chat while the presenters are giving their presentations. It will be turned on at the end of the meeting so people can submit questions or comments. Just a reminder for everybody to please mute themselves. Thank you. Okay, everybody, we're going to get started here. Welcome today to the December CEP monthly call. And I am trying to here we go. My name is Mary DeWitt Jaw, and I'm a manager for partnerships at national headquarters in the community engagement and partnerships team. And today we have a wonderful group of presenters, and we have Kendall Jarvis from Disaster Legal Assistance Collaborative in California. And we have Laura Tuggle from Southeast Louisiana Legal Services. And we have Red Cross Greater Carolinas region, Eliza Gevertz will be presenting. And just to let everyone know, I have disabled the chat so that everybody can focus on what the presenters are saying. The chat will be turned on at the end of the meeting so that people can submit questions or comments. I am also recording this meeting and it will be available after the event today. So we are going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to first start with what is Legal Services Corporation. Legal Services is the single largest funder of civil legal aid for low-income Americans in the nation. They were established in 1974 as a nonprofit corporation that promotes equal access to justice and provides grants for high-quality civil legal assistance to low-income Americans. LSC distributes more than 90% of its funding to 134 independent nonprofit legal aid programs with more than 800 offices across the USA. Who is helped by LSC funded programs? People who live in households with annual incomes at or below 125% federal poverty guidelines.
It's a new public campaign. As you mentioned, there are new travel restrictions as well.
Please mute your line. Thank you. In 2021, these numbers equate to $16,100 for an individual and $33,125 for a family of 4. Their clients come from every ethnic group, every age group. They live in rural, suburban, and urban areas. They are the working poor, veterans, homeowners and renters, families with children, farmers, people with disabilities, and the elderly. Women comprise 70% of the clients. Many of them are struggling to keep their children safe and their families together. American Red Cross and Legal Services Corporation signed an MOU in 2008, and their services are delivered through state legal aid organizations for low-income people. What's important to understand is the type of services that are included. It's landlord-tenant disputes and evictions, government benefits, financial and housing assistance, creditors, consumer scams, late utility bills, insurance, wills, probate, domestic violence, bankruptcy, crisis counseling, and FEMA assistance. This is their work. This is how their work supports the Red Cross. They support survivors of disasters with many of the issues that they have after. I wanted to show you some legal aid resources we have on the Red Cross Exchange. Here is just a picture of when you go to the MOU page, you will see Legal Services Corporation, and then you will see several documents here, free legal resources, legal problems faced by disaster survivors. So that's a good document. It helps you understand all the things that legal aid agencies can help our disaster survivors with. And then there was a disaster task force that Red Cross participated on several years ago. And this is a great report that really tells you about their work. Here is just a picture of the free legal assistance document that's on the exchange. It was the very first one. And it's a great document in that it gives all the information about all different types of free legal resources. So do take a look at this when you get a minute. You can download it and use it. And then we need your help in spreading the word to other Red Cross staff, volunteers, as well as disaster survivors, so they can understand that working with a lawyer can save them time, avoiding missed deadlines and frustration, and just to help them get the relief they need. These lawyers are trained and dedicated. I worked with many of them for years, and this is what they want to do, and they're there to help. We also need your help in getting the word out in your community that this is free legal help. Share the resources that you're seeing today and all this information to caseworkers, long-term recovery workers and committees, local partners, churches, civic groups, and even through social media. How to work with your local legal aid office. You can refer to the LSC and Red Cross MOU. Arrange a meeting with the director of your local legal aid office to discuss the partnership and how you might work together locally. You can also contact myself or Patty Higginbotham, who is my volunteer partner, and we can make an introduction or email mobilize@redcross.org. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kendall Jarvis, who is a disaster legal attorney, and she works with what's called DLAC, the Disaster Legal Assistance Collaborative in California.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much. That's a great intro. So as Mary said, my name is Kendall Jarvis, and I'm the lead disaster relief attorney for Legal Aid of Sonoma County. We started the disaster relief team in 2017 after the Sonoma complex fires. Since that time, our community has seen many additional fires, unfortunately, as well as a pretty severe flood. So the work has continued to grow. As part of the work that we do, there are sort of two sides to it. One is what does legal aid do, and the other is what does the disaster relief team do specifically. So real quickly, just to give a broad perspective, there's a lot of sort of outward movement from a disaster. So it's important to know what the legal services provider in your area does in general, not just necessarily their team in specific response to disaster due to such crossover. So for example, like with Legal Aid of Sonoma County, We deal with housing issues like eviction. We deal with domestic violence issues. We deal with vets issues. We deal with homelessness prevention. There's an elder relief team, and we continue to grow. So this can vary from agency to agency. So it's important to know what resources your legal aid can provide in general, and then also specifically what kind of disaster response. But again, just to reiterate, for example, domestic violence increases after a disaster. So that might be something that our DV team handles, but it's something that is tentatively connected to a disaster and that a lot of people need help and support with. So it's important to, search all of those pieces and not just look at the disaster piece, even though the disaster piece is often the best initial point of reference or contact. So for our disaster relief team, things kind of change depending on where you are at a disaster. So we started in 2017, which means that we have a different trajectory for those survivors versus the fires that came in 2019 and 2020. So initially, the biggest and most important thing I think to understand is that legal aids will be at a local assistance center. They will be at a disaster recovery center. They will be where they are allowed to be and hopefully where they know that they should be. So most of us learn as we go, right? So Red Cross is I was going to say a bit, but I should say miles ahead of us in terms of the fact that you guys are obviously one of the leading disaster response agencies, not just in the country, but in the world. So sometimes you might have to kind of, work with your local legal aid to see what they're going to do and how they're going to respond. But minimally, they should have some stand-up programs that help with those immediate needs. And I'll talk about DLAC in just a second, which is also super important to know as a resource. So from a legal aid standpoint, one of the important things to know is most people, most survivors, as well as non-survivors, do not realize that the issues that arise in a disaster / post-disaster, and often even pre-disaster, disaster prep, are not purely financial or purely emotional, that almost all of them have some crossover with a legal services need. And I say that because people don't really realize where their needs are until they face this issue. Even people that feel like they're prepared in case this kind of event occurs. But as you all know, once it occurs, there's kind of this, what am I supposed to do next idea? And a lot of those issues that arise, whether it be the initial need to register for FEMA, or if you're fortunate enough to be insured, to file an insurance claim, or the rebuilding process where you need to deal with construction, or if you're, tentatively connected in terms of an impact, like your employer was impacted, so your work is closed, or if you need to apply for a benefit of some kind, whether that be disaster unemployment or CalFresh. All of those present a sort of crossover between the needs of organizations like yourselves, as well as disaster case management and legal services, to all come together and say, okay, one part is we need to educate people. The other part is we need to simplify this process. And oftentimes legal aid providers can help simplify that process to point people in the right direction, to also help individuals like yourselves that are helping survivors identify the fact that they actually need legal assistance to begin with. So important to understand that there's a broad array of services that people will need, and that a huge amount of that has, really falls into a few categories, right? One is the immediate needs, and that's the stuff you guys see right away on the ground. Like, I need food, I need shelter. But post that, it's what do I do now? And the what do I do now is really the time where it's super important for legal aid providers and community-based organizations like the Red Cross to come together to identify the needs within a community. And the needs can vary from person to person, obviously, as well as community to community. Sometimes we will have communities that have a significant amount of insurance, right? Other times we'll have communities that basically can't purchase insurance at all, which puts us in a very different situation, because the financial wherewithal to be able to have, effective temporary housing, effective access to food, effective access to healthcare, effective access to the ability to rebuild or repurchase or be rehoused in a way that's stable. That can shift, but legal aids can help identify what those needs are and work through the processes that are sort of connected to them, whether it be literally there's a dispute with a landlord, nobody knows their rights in a rentership situation, which is often true. Nobody knows how to work through the insurance process, or it seems like their insurance company is kind of taking advantage of them, or they're attempting to work through the FEMA process and they're denied. So all of these things are pretty common, where we would think, generally speaking, disasters are the one circumstance where it's clearly not the survivor's fault. So we would kind of think that the process would be easier than it is. But in reality, that is far from the truth. That at every step of the way, we see individual survivors and households have major struggles related to attempting to get access to very simplistic benefits or even to assert very simplistic rights. So again, that's why it's important to understand those rights and also create relationships with your local legal aid office. I will also say that, as Mary mentioned, legal aids vary in terms of whether or not they have income requirements and what those income requirements are. So, for example, like in Legal Aid of Sonoma County, our housing program is funded similarly to LSC, which means that from an eviction standpoint, only people that identify within a certain income cap allowability will be able to gain access to the housing program. However, that isn't true for our disaster relief program. So it may be possible that someone attempts to go to housing because they have a housing issue that's eviction related, but it's also tentatively connected to a disaster, and they're slightly over income. We all know, especially in California, the cost of living is so high that the income standards federally don't really apply here as well as they might apply in other areas or other parts of the country. So there may be people that are incredibly vulnerable but don't qualify financially, yet our disaster relief program could help with the same issues. So it's also important to know who is in a position to get help and then who's in a position to help. It might not be enough to just say, let's call housing and reach out to them, because maybe it makes sense to reach out to multiple programs to see. And it also might be possible that you have more than one legal aid in your immediate area, and or that there are potentially crossover opportunities, meaning like with the Butte County fires in California, for example. Those fires were so devastating that most people left the area, right? So their loss was in Butte County, but maybe now they're living in, Plumas County or, Mendocino County or something like that. If that's true, there are sort of two ways to look at it. One is my loss was in Butte County, so what legal service provider can help me in Butte County? And then the second is, okay, what legal service provider can help me where I now live? And there may be possibility to have multiple legal service providers assist in that way. So that's sort of the overview of the legal aid piece. The secondary piece that we wanted to discuss is DLAC. So the Disaster Legal Assistance Collaborative, that was formerly known as BARC, is essentially a state collaborative that started as a Northern California collaborative, but has now grown a lot, that brings not only legal service providers, but also community-based organizations and government entities like FEMA, the California Office of Emergency Services, etc., into one place to identify the response needs in any given fire. And in theory, as we hope, since we, knock on wood, have had a little downtime this year in California, we'll also be able to help do more things to prepare both individuals within the community, but also other community-based organizations to be aware of the services we provide, be aware of how to best prepare for a disaster, what considerations need to come into play. Since DLAC has grown significantly, we've been able to do a number of things. So one is, not only do we now know if there is a need in any given area, that there will be an on-the-ground response and there will be support for that response. And what that means is, let's say that they're like the fires in Greenville and the surrounding areas, Plumas County, the Dixie Fire, etc. There was an initial response by the LSC funded program there called LISNIC that was at local assistance centers and the like. And then there was a further response because it became apparent that due to the rural nature and the lack of internet access, etc., that there was a need for added layers of support. So that's when DLAC comes in. And they say, okay, LISNIC can handle this portion of it, but the community needs a broader based legal support system. So DLAC came in, and at this point, a number of other legal aid providers and or pro bono volunteers have come to show up at local assistance centers to meet with the community, to help educate people on their rights, to move the long-term recovery group forward. So it's sort of a variety of issues that DLAC can help with, and we're really always trying to be there for each other. So if any community has a need that isn't filled, we want to know about it. And it is true that there are going to be some places that just don't have a significant legal service provider program related to disasters. For example, this happened a lot in Santa Cruz. And in that case, if you reach out to DLAC, then DLAC can try and help on that level to fill those gaps. And in order to fill those gaps, we can do a few things. Number one, we have a statewide hotline that people can call. You can call yourselves if you have a legal question on behalf of someone else, or you can direct people to call that number as well. It'll direct you to an area that is covered, and or there's an option 9, as we're calling it, another option that says if you don't hear the community within which you're attempting to find support, press this number. And what that will do is obviously direct you to a legal service provider in your area that has a disaster program to some extent, and or B, if you push the last option, option 9, it will connect you with pro bono support. And what's really, really great about DLAC is that part of it is we all know sort of the areas we cover, how we work together, how we can provide coverage and support to other people, but we also have this great pro bono support. And pro bono support is really private attorneys that are willing to volunteer and donate their time to help when these issues arise. Unfortunately, we have had a pretty significant amount of interest and consistent volunteerism in that arena. So if there is not a legal service provider directly in your area, DLAC can still help by connecting you with a pro bono attorney. And the hotline is a great way to start. You can also obviously reach out to Mary, and she will find us, track us down, and connect you. You can always email me, but these are, important things to know and understand. The goal of DLAC is to be there for really any of the issues that we can cover, especially those that are faced by the most vulnerable, right? At some point, there are income decisions, whether it's a specific income cutoff or it's simply that the individual should, or the family or household should have access to a private attorney. I will say, interestingly enough, we have discovered within the past 4.5, 5 years that a lot of the issues that arise in a disaster are not covered by the private bar, meaning they're not covered by private attorneys because they're kind of obscure areas of the law, and or they're, the financial implication for the private attorney would be significant in trying to forward an issue that might not be guaranteed recovery. So it's even more important for that fact to reach out to legal service providers and reach out to pro bono to really make sure that the biggest question is, do people have access to justice? Do survivors have access to justice? Do they have their needs met in a way? And all of these financial issues really are connected to, except for the immediate emergency response, they're really connected to legal needs as well. So it's really important to understand that and sort of move through that. I will say DLAC has a website, and it's disasterlegalservicesca.org. I'm sure Mary can send that around too. There's also a hotline flyer, as I mentioned. And then the third thing beyond that is there is an online platform called Free Legal Answers. And free legal answers can be used to basically ask a question in an online forum. So if you don't want to have a conversation, if it's easier to write down your question, you can submit a question online. It will be responded to generally within a week. We're trying to shorten that time frame, but that's currently how it stands, and by a volunteer attorney. And it will also be reviewed by an expert. So there is, a consistent positive response in terms of the quality that is being provided in those answers. And that can be really, really helpful for people as well. So I will say, using the hotline, using Free Legal Answers, using a direct legal services provider, a lot of that is going to depend on whether or not there are time restraints on whatever issue you're dealing with. Like if someone is in danger of becoming homeless because the immediate temporary shelter support is running out, and or the Red Cross funding is running out, and you're having a hard time finding additional funding for an individual because your guys' program obviously has a variety of rules associated with how long you can get such assistance. If that individual really needed insurance funds that hadn't been paid out, or really needed FEMA funds that hadn't been paid out, then it's definitely worth it to go straight to either your legal services provider or a pro bono attorney directly, and or reach out to Mary. And sorry to keep putting Mary on the spot, but she can connect you with someone that can help with a very time sensitive issue. And that's really one of the great pieces of having this sort of two-tiered plan, where you have immediate responders on the ground from a legal standpoint, and then you have DLAC. So we always have other people to turn to help and support any community that needs that kind of help and support. I will also say, finally, that one of the things that many of us legal service providers do, myself included, as well as DLAC, is really training and education. It is so important to build a rapport with your local CBOs and your national CBOs. The Red Cross is in basically every single disaster. I bet you there's no one on the phone that could name a disaster that Red Cross has not been in. At least within my lifetime, I couldn't tell you one. So, having that understanding of who the people are on the ground for both parties is super, super important. I know that, Mary and I talk all the time when these kinds of things go on, just to see, how we can best support each other, because there really is a lot of crossover, and it's great to know that. And then I will also say that we're happy to have trainings in a way that you guys want to dictate. If you have a question like, hey, we're seeing this issue come up a lot, we don't really know what we're supposed to do about it, or, you're kind of in the interim where there's no disaster case management program up and running, so there needs to be a response, and either you guys are willing to do that, or you need someone to step in to do that, and there's the potential to train volunteers to do that. We're happy to do that kind of thing, and also to go deeper into what the legal issues are and really how you can respond to them. I didn't want to overwhelm you by talking about FEMA and insurance and housing and employment this entire time. So, but if you have questions like that, please do let us know. If you want to have a roundtable or something like that where people can ask questions, we're always open to that. Basically, we're open from a training and education standpoint, whether it's to community members, to CBOs, to whomever needs that type of education. That's a very important piece of what DLAC does. So, always feel free to reach out and ask for any kind of support on that level. I will also say that this help is more helpful than I think people really recognize. So, for example, in Sonoma County, we've leveraged, in my program alone, we've leveraged over $16 million for fire survivors. And that might be a small number in terms of how much money is lost in disasters, right? But when you look at the impact on the most vulnerable populations, it's extreme. We had a mobile home park here that was lost called Journey's End Mobile Home Park. And there were 44 homes that remained standing, but the infrastructure of the park was completely destroyed. So there was no access to water, no access to electricity, no access to plumbing, none, no utilities at all. And the insurance industry and FEMA both said, you know, you're just fine. Your house is still standing. Was a term they continuously used. It's still standing, as if that made it habitable or that made it safe to live in. Obviously, the park was condemned, so it was clearly not safe. The EPA found tons of carcinogenic materials within the park. The fire was over 2,500 degrees, came right up to these homes. Many were damaged, but theoretically not completely destroyed. And they were on their own. If we didn't have a program to stand up for these individuals, no one else was going to. And even private attorneys wouldn't have, because the cost of a mobile home is not significant. So for them, there's not a huge payout. And then that's an awful thing to say about my counterparts in the private bar, but it is true that there are those sort of business decisions that are made. And with the work of both Legal Aid of Sonoma County and then the collaborative through DLAC, we were able to do two things. One was have FEMA recognize on a national level that these 44 individuals are eligible, period. And FEMA conceded, and those individuals that were eligible got support, even though they were all blanketedly told no prior to. And then there were an additional 20 who had insurance that couldn't get access to that insurance. And we had to fight tooth and nail. I'm not going to say it was easy. Some insurance companies caved earlier than others, but eventually I was able to get every single person in that park access to the insurance monies that they were entitled to. And these people have been near homelessness, homeless or precariously housed on many, 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 many occasions while we were trying to get this help, and working with additional CBOs like Red Cross, you know, like Catholic Charities. We were able to stably house these people while we were working on these legal issues in the background. And I can't tell you how grateful those individuals are. I mean, I get holiday cards from them, you know. They text me on Thanksgiving. Like the impact of these individuals is so great that makes these relationships all worth it, because I couldn't have done it alone, you know, and nor could the CBOs. It has to be this connected effort that really sees where those holes are and how we can prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable. So I could go on forever, as you can well tell. Mary can send out my email if anyone has follow-up questions, but that is my piece for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendall. I appreciate that. We will have questions at the end, so hold your questions, write them down, and we are going to our next presenter, Laura Tuggle from Southeast Louisiana Legal Services. And Laura, just tell me when to change the slide, and I will do that. All right. And Laura, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me know. Good afternoon, and I appreciate your warm welcome and you accommodating my needing to come on a little late. I really was enjoying listening to that prior presentation. It rings a lot of bells. In Louisiana, we have had at least 10 major disasters since Hurricane Katrina. Of note, most recently, on the 16th anniversary of Katrina, on August 29th, 2021, we had another big one with Hurricane Ida. FEMA registration ended I believe, Monday of this week, and there's over 815,000 people registered for FEMA. The population of the state is 4.6 million, so that's getting close to 20% of the entire population of the state. In some of our parishes, we have parishes, not counties, but in some of our parishes, 1 in 3 people that live there have put in a FEMA claim. So this is going to be another very big long-term response for our community. So, we provide free civil legal aid to low-income people, mostly through a staff attorney model, although we do coordinate with pro bono partners. So we mostly are providing disaster legal services after, some time of either a pandemic or whether it's a natural disaster. Special kind of issues come up in addition to sort of our bread and butter kind of work that we do. And we know that civil legal aid is often really overlooked, but also very essential solution to stabilizing families. And that is whether it's a big or a small disaster. If an individual family loses their home in a fire, we would love to coordinate more closely with our local Red Crosses when something like that happens, because those families inevitably are going to also have some unmet legal needs. And the one that most frequently springs to mind, if they're a renter, a lot of times they prepaid their rent, they have a deposit, and a lot of times they can't get that back from their landlord. If it's a homeowner, then they may be struggling with issues related to the loss of the home or an insurance claim, or sometimes they've got what we call a succession, the rest of the country called probate, that they have to deal with. So really, whether it's big or small, the Red Cross should definitely know about legal aid and how it can assist you guys in your mission and the people you serve. Can you move to the next slide? Mary, you can move that. Oh, perfect. Thank you. So this is just a slide with some of the different types of things that we do. You guys can kind of read that there, but when we say housing, we really mean landlord-tenant issues or foreclosure issues, heir property matters, probate issues. Most of those other things you may be pretty familiar with, some of our family law and domestic violence work. But another big thing that we do when there's a disaster is specific FEMA cases, disaster unemployment, contractor fraud becomes big, unfortunately. Landlord-tenant issues explode, evictions explode. Some of these things happen on the very front end of a disaster. And then as recovery funds, insurance proceeds start flowing, then you're going to have the contractor fraud and other issues related to clearing title. It's kind of a predictable pattern. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so just to give you a couple of examples of what we're talking about and what we do. We have an example of a client that we're calling Jim here, who lost his job due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was facing eviction. He found one of our flyers at a food bank, gave us a call, and at that time we raised some special CARES Act eviction protections, and the eviction was dismissed, so that family was able to stay in their home. A specific disaster case, to give you an idea, is Paula. We've changed her name too. Her home was flooded during Ida. She made an insurance claim for the damages. However, she and her husband had owned the home together, and he had died a few years ago, and no probate was ever open. So when she got a settlement check from the insurance company, it was in the name of her and her deceased husband. So she couldn't cash the check. She had a delay in repairing her home, and we were able to get in and help resolve that matter so that she could cash that check. Next slide. So you can go ahead and change that slide again. So I just wanted, I'm not going to go through all these lessons learned. We've had so many disasters that, we have had some real takeaways, but the main one I want to mention for the purposes of today is number one, you've got to really be connecting with your partners, your community, organizations like the Red Cross, to be prepared in advance. That is definitely something that you don't want to be just making a relationship when you're dealing with a catastrophic disaster. So that's really important. Next slide. And this one I think we'll skip through too. We'll skip through that one. So this one I wanted to mention, we did some looking at our case data. Our last really big disaster was 2016 when there was really significant flooding in part of our state. That disaster, there was 155,000 people that had applied for FEMA in that particular disaster. And one thing we noticed that were seniors, folks, we use 60 and older. We typically, they're about 15% of our caseload, but they represented 28% of our disaster cases. With folks living with disabilities, typically they're about 19% of our caseload. That also went up to about 28%. And then this really interesting phenomena with veterans. They're usually only about 1 to 1.5% of our caseload, but they jumped up to 7.5%. So we're not exactly sure what caused that jump, other than we did do a fair amount of targeted outreach with organizations that serve veterans. So potentially maybe that was very effective. Next slide. So this is a graphic we put together after Katrina, to sort of visually show sort of that timeline, which unfortunately is all too predictable. When in the beginning of the disaster, you're going to have evictions, other kind of temporary benefit programs are going to really spike. And then it took a little while because the disaster funding for a big homeowner rebuilding program, it didn't even come out until 2.5 years after the disaster. And so title clearing work, helping people access long-term recovery benefits, and contractor fraud was really delayed because the money didn't start flowing. There's usually a much shorter gap in time in most really big disasters than what we saw in Katrina. And then, of course, we have a lot of work that we do around affordable housing advocacy and other work to just sustain our communities. Next slide. I just threw this one in here since COVID is also an unbelievably impactful disaster of a different sort. Our housing caseload went up almost 300% for evictions, for requests for assistance. And that got an incredible amount of attention in our local media and in our community. The sort of the metric that went up exponentially, which didn't get nearly as much attention, was unemployment compensation claims. Louisiana is tourism, hospitality, restaurant, music kind of place, which is all driven by people coming here. And all of that fell out of the bottom. So we're having some really long-term impacts. and our request for legal assistance for unemployment compensation went up 2,020% as compared to what it was pre-COVID. So it was an unbelievable increase of what we saw. Next slide. So this is just a slide we had put together for a different purpose, and it kind of shows, like, in each of our main offices, how much the biggest jump in particular offices. And in New Orleans, that 20% for unemployment was even bigger. It was 2,533% just for that particular office, because, you know, we have hospitality industry in New Orleans. Next slide. I think I'm getting close to the end. So how can you reach us? So we, after COVID, we have a disaster hotline that we kind of only activate when there's an active disaster, and that is our phone number. So we now have, we changed it to the COVID line, but it actually is the special line that we use for both any kind of disaster, whether it's COVID or natural disaster. So, you know, we kind of had both things sort of on top of each other. Next slide. So that's just my contact information in case you would want to reach out at all. I would love to be connected. Like Mary, you know, we really do kind of want to follow up with our local Red Cross about sort of these smaller disasters, especially fires, to go ahead and make that connection. And I don't know if our previous speaker showed this, but there is also a National Disaster Legal Aid Resource Center, disasterlegalaid.org, which has a lot of good information, you know, both for individual disaster survivors, for legal aid organizations, and just kind of the general public as well. And then we contribute pretty heavily to louisianalawhelp.org and our own blog, and we've really been stepping up legal information pieces that we put together for anyone, regardless of income, post-COVID. In last year, in 2020, we had over 725,000 people go on our blog and access some of our resources. So we have never had that kind of attention to resources that we have prepared. So we're getting a lot of traction out of that. So we're going to continue doing that. And that might be a good place to kind of refer folks to, in addition to some of the options that our prior speaker gave. So that's all I've got. Glad to take questions if it's allowed or whatever. I don't know what your setup is.
Oh, we have one more presenter, Laura, and then we're going to open it for questions.
Gotcha.
It looks like we might go a little over 3. I'm not sure, or 3 o'clock my time. If you and Kendall are able to stay on, but if you are, I'll hold it open for people to ask questions. Thank you.
That's fine with me.
All right, and our next presenter is Eliza Gevertz, and she is from Red Cross in North Carolina. And she is going to talk about her partnership with Legal Aid of North Carolina. All yours, Eliza.
Thanks, Mary, so much. Thank you for inviting me to present to my colleagues and friends across the country. It's really exciting. So let me tell you what you're looking at. This map came out of RC View, and it's a zoomed in map to Western North Carolina, where Tropical Depression Fred and parts of Ida ravaged rural areas of Haywood County, Transylvania County, and part of Buncombe counties. It's about southwest of Asheville, by about half hour, 45 minutes or so. That's the sort of circle of highways on your right there. And the green areas show our national forest. However, you can tell by the dots that appear, there are plenty of houses and a river runs through it. In red, what you see are about 95 homes that were assessed as completely destroyed by the flood, literally washed down the river in many cases. In orange, there were 260 homes that were assessed as major damage and almost 300 others with minor or effective damage. So for these last two categories, you know that Red Cross money can't go to them. We're only able to provide funds for those with major and destroyed. And so for those, we can assist with some financial help. It's surely not enough to rebuild a home. And so, of course, that's where our partners come in. Folk like the Baptist, Team Rubicon, Rebuild, and Habitat are called upon to help initially, if they're able, to maybe put some stairs back or a ramp that washed away. But long-term, organizations like Legal Aid provide the assistance to those who need expert help to navigate the federal and state and local statutes. And there are success stories. And so my story today begins with them. A client applied to FEMA and was denied, as many people experience. It was denied, their claim was denied because of a lack of documentation of ownership, which happens to be very common in rural areas. But Legal Aid was able to discuss with them their appeal options. First of all, that there is an appeal process, and also help them get together the necessary documentation. They talked with them and provided a new self-attestation option for ownership. And ultimately what that resulted in was that FEMA received it, and to the appeal, they were successful. And the client went from an award of $0 originally to $24,000. And it's all due to the work of Legal Aid in Western North Carolina. Next slide. So Legal Aid of North Carolina is a statewide nonprofit law firm that provides legal services in civil matters to low-income people in order to ensure that equal access to justice and to remove barriers to economic opportunity, right? This is straight off their website. They help individuals and families and communities with legal problems affecting basic human needs, such as family and housing, education, employment, and income. And their area of law, much like has been spoken about by Laurel and Kendall, is that they deal with civil rights and community development and consumer and debt, credit, bankruptcy issues, disability, education, elder law, just a myriad of different issues that can plague anyone at any time in their lives, but affect mostly those with low income. And so I wanted to show you these superheroes because that's what they are in my eyes. Leslie is the person on the left at the altar facing forward. She is the Western North Carolina lead. And so she and her colleagues got together a few weekends ago in Haywood County, where sort of the epicenter of rebuilding and recovery tools have been located at a local church, the UMC in Crusoe. It's really the epicenter of activity. And she held a talk on Friday night. And then Saturday was back at UMC Crusoe to meet with several clients. And then on Sunday, it was a full weekend of helping clients. They went back to the Asheville office. And we were told that there were at least a dozen locals there. And I wanted to just say, give a shout out to Patty and Mary for alerting me about the clinics through their connections, because even though we had met during the the disaster relief operation, I didn't know about this follow-up clinic that they were offering. So when we found out, we shared it far and wide in social media, with Spanish-speaking newspapers and such, basically everywhere we could, including the Facebook page that was created after the Haywood flood. And so with that partnership, we were able, they said that the sharing of those flyers actually brought double the amount of people that they had expected, which is awesome. So next slide. So this is Lake Junaluska. If you recall the first slide, there's a lake far to the left, probably hour and a half outside of west of Asheville. And Red Cross had a shelter open here. It's kind of cool, not your average gymnasium. No, these were cabins on the lake. And later, several weeks later, they were taken control of by the county, who then footed the bill for them. But many, many people were staying at the cabins. And Lake Junaluska happens to be, I learned in my CEP role there, it's a very affluent area. It's a very religious area in terms of giving, and their feelings about how to help thy neighbor. And so I learned of local volunteers by just asking and asking and asking everyone, you know, who might be available as a local community volunteer. And I found out that there is a lovely group of women at this in this community in Lake Junaluska, and they have an 800-person strong email distribution network that they have used not only for this disaster, but for past disasters. And they're able to very quickly get out the word for many unmet needs. And so no request was too big or too small, and they were able to deliver direct to the clients. So really, Red Cross simply connected the dots for that to happen. And we were so glad to be able to do that. Go ahead, next slide. So during my visit to the Asheville office, I chatted with the lawyer who runs the legal aid region in Western North Carolina, and I asked about the organization's wins, you know, during the disaster, their difficulties, and the nature of the organization that helps so many people. And it turns out there are several hundred attorneys who work for legal aid across the state, which I had no idea the numbers were so high. So that was wonderful information to find out. And so I proceeded to walk around the event and came across one of these things that you usually have an event, some takeaways, right? This is a Ziploc bag, and it had all the information that a FEMA applicant might need. You know, suggestions regarding tenant-landlord issues that they might come across. It had numbers and emails and websites and where to get more information and file claims. And so I complimented the woman, lawyer, who had put it together on its thoroughness. And then she told me a story I thought you might find funny. She purchased some legal aid bling to accent the packet and to draw attention to it, encouraging potential clients to pick up the packet, you know, like as if they're walking across a table, let's say, with lots of things. This might be something that they would pick up because of the bling attached. But what she didn't realize at the time, until she was pulling it all together, was that her choice of a floating keychain may have appeared as a little, you know, tone deaf to those who had just experienced a flood. But all was forgiven. And amidst the suffering, you know, there was joy shared and also good humor between partners, I think, which is really essential to a long-lasting, genuine relationship. Go ahead, next slide. So in CEP, you know, we have very specific ways of connecting people. There are lots of suggestions, but a lot of it you kind of do on the wing. You do what feels right. You try and get in on conversations. And so I put together a few things that I do when I am a manager in a CEP role, no matter if I'm local to that town or not. So it happens that I found out that legal aid was in town and gaining momentum because I was listening in on the VOAD calls that I made sure that I was on, you know, on their weekly or daily basis at that time. So I copied and pasted the chat where VOAD members put their phone and email contact information. And from there, I put each person from the organization in a separate line on an Excel spreadsheet, because that's what we're using right now for our customer relationship management. And I reached out to the legal aid folks when I heard on a different call about the community that bilingual flyers and lawyers who could speak Spanish were needed. It was pointed out sort of as a sidebar conversation that turned out to be very crucial for success, is that you can create a bilingual flyer, but it is understood that folks reading the flyer then who dial the number, that they will reach someone who speaks Spanish or their language that you've done the flyer in, right? And what was happening was, though we could create, or they had created a bilingual flyer, they didn't have folks on the receiving end of those calls. So we were able to connect the dots in that way, and they were able to resolve those issues. And when I spoke with legal aid, I asked that great question, how can I help? And the answers vary, of course, in every disaster. Every disaster is different. Every community is different, like has been said earlier today. So, you never know what you're going to hear, but you're always going to learn something, right? So maybe this equated to asking our local LET folks to translate a flyer, or maybe they could be those volunteers to help translate conversations between a lawyer and a client. Maybe we could simply deliver a bunch of flyers to an event because Red Cross was going that way anyway. Maybe we could ask legal aid to present to Red Cross clients at the community meals site in June, Alaska. Maybe we could simply post information, their information, relaying it on our Greater Carolinas Facebook page. The possibilities, of course, are endless, but you never know. And so many times Red Cross doesn't have what it is exactly that a partner needs. But what we do have as CEP folks is the ability to keep a long list of organizations who may be able to help. And so our role, again, is to connect those dots. And I found this to be true when I came across and started following the Haywood County Flood 2021 Facebook page that obviously came about right after the flood. I monitor it still. And what I found was that there were several folks who had posted about their experiences with FEMA, really sad, hopeless folks that, the kind of posts that make you cry, right? They had been denied or ignored. And so I contacted my person, Brian is his name, at Legal Aid, who I'd been in contact with quite a bit during the disaster relief operation. And I said, hey, this has been posted and I know that you can help. Can you provide a reply? And he did so. And of course, that ended up providing hope to those really who had lost it. So again, connecting the dots, even in ways that don't cost us anything, maybe just a phone call, are great ways that we can help. Next slide. And then how do you partner post disaster relief operation? Like Laura said, you always want to make sure that you're passing out your business card ahead of the disaster. But what happens when you get back into blue sky? What kinds of ways can you work together? And so what I learned from Angie, the woman who oversees the entire state, that several hundred lawyers, like I was saying, work for legal aid. And we started talking about how can we partner with our different programs to spread the word about what Red Cross does and to spread the word about what legal aid does. And she perked up immediately and she suggested, just off the top of her head, why don't we swap lunch and learns sessions so that perhaps we could bring them Be Red Cross Ready or Ready Rating during one lunch and learn, and they could provide a seminar much like what Laura and Kendall suggested, at the top of the hour. So we now had a reason to chat again, right? We swapped business cards. And I still monitor that Haywood County flood Facebook page because it's true, folks are still suffering now 3 months later. But when I come across an issue that legal aid might be able to address, I reach out to Leslie and Brian and others. And it just so happens I received a lovely thank you note from Brian from legal aid, who let me know that our presence, Red Cross's presence at those clinics on Friday and Saturday and Sunday made all the difference. That Red Cross staff who had just showed up, who had introduced themselves, who had asked what they could do, who thanked them for their community service and created a conduit for future partnerships was just so appreciated. And so I'll be following up with regional leadership to find out how we might be able to make those lunch and learn swaps happen, and be viable resources to communities in advance of disasters or after they've dropped out of the news cycle. But more than anything, I think it's important to use LinkedIn to stay connected with people, you know, in nonprofits and in everywhere. People move from one job to the other, but your professional connection through LinkedIn will endure even after lots of company changes. And so for certain, it reminds me of Maya Angelou's quote that they may forget what you said or what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. So next slide. So this was just a few weekends ago, and of course the CEP manager role that I had on DRO 226, it had ended back in October, and I knew I couldn't expense the trip to Red Cross. It was about 2.5, 3 hours from my home, and we wanted to make it to every single event that Legal Aid had that weekend. So I decided to combine this business trip to Western North Carolina with a pleasure trip. It wasn't a bad thing. It's leaf peeping season time in Blue Ridge territory. If you've ever heard of it, it's very common to just drive the area and see the beautiful sights. And despite the devastation that had occurred there just a few months prior, it was spectacular. And so I just wanted to share this picture of me, my husband, and our little Chug puppin enjoying a morning walk around Lake Junaluska. And that was before we headed out to the Asheville Clinic on Sunday on our way home. And I think for many of us, you know, the CEP role never really stops. It's part of who we are in our DNA. And just because a DRO winds up, you know, we still keep on thinking during work hours or not, how we might find ourselves searching for ways to connect with people and communities. And so I'm just so glad I was able to be there in Haywood County, Western North Carolina. And once again, thank you so much, Mary and Patty, for alerting me to this great opportunity.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Aliza. Wonderful, wonderful information for our field folks. Okay, everybody, that concludes our presentation for today. We are over the hour. I don't know if our presenters are able to stay on the line or to answer questions or not. A few minutes.
I'm happy to stay.
I'm happy to stay.
Oh, great.
It's the legal aid in us. We'll
All
be
right,
there
I'm
if
gonna
you need
stop.
us.
Wonderful. I'm going to stop the presentation so we can just talk. And then I did open up the chat. So either raise your hand or put something in the chat and we can answer questions. And then for Red Cross people, I will be posting the recording in the Teams meeting in the chat. It probably won't be there till either later today or tomorrow morning. And I'll post other information that we talked about. So let me do this.
Hi, Mary, it's Monica. You have a question from Jack.
From Jack. Let me open up the chat.
Oh, it's not in the chat. His hand is up.
Oh,
go ahead, Jack.
Oh, then just go, Jack.
I thank the ladies for the presentations very much. You may not, I may think I'm going too far in a different direction. In addition to responding to all these disasters, as Red Cross does and Legal Aid does, I'm looking forward. Climate change is happening. You are going to more fires in California and Oregon. You're going to more flooding in Louisiana and in Carolinas. This is a reality. We're going to have more of this. So not only are we going to have a role in all these response activities that was the subject today, we're going to have to start thinking about, as organizations, the activities that are going on to either to accommodate and be prepared for these in the future, how we're going to mitigate these things in the future, how we're going to have resilience in communities in the future. Now that goes beyond the scope of today's presentation, but it very much is where the world is going. Red Cross right now is trying to develop a climate change policy or attitude about things. So I just want to what you all think about how Red Cross and the legal organizations, the other ladies with Red Cross, how we can work together in the future as we talk to these communities in Louisiana that have been repeatedly hit by these floods again and again, year after year, the same individuals. In the West, some of these homes in these neighborhoods have burned multiple times. So there's going to be a whole different thing about legal responses in the future and Red Cross in the future, and how we work with the entities that are trying to prepare that way.
We think we're kind of already there, so I definitely agree with you. California, as well as places like Louisiana, some of us get hit harder than other states, so not all states have caught up there. But I will say something that Laura said really rang to mind that I didn't really bring up in my presentation, which was a huge part of the work that we do, both Legal Aid of Sonoma County and also DLAC, is related to advocacy and policy changes, because these issues really need to be addressed on a state level, on a local level, and also on a federal level. So it's super, super important to bring these concerns and create these partnerships. And I can't say how important it is. Also, something that Eliza said brought this to mind, that Red Cross is a trusted partner. They've been here for so long that people trust you. They trust your voice. So when you guys say something and you say, this is a real issue, that suddenly really gives credence to the rest of us that really want to push that forward and completely agree, but maybe have hit some walls. And I know that for DLAC specifically in California, we have been creating basically subcommittees, and one of them works on advocacy, and climate justice is a really important issue in that advocacy committee, and something that is being pushed on a federal and state level. There are some laws that are being considered by Congress in the pipeline to consider climate events themselves actual disasters, but that doesn't necessarily address how to really effectively respond to the fact that the rest of these disasters have increased so significantly. So if it's something you're interested in, if you have ideas about it, we would, whoever you're, local and or non-local, quite frankly, like if we're talking about federal law, it could kind of be anyone, but we're always willing to have those conversations. And maybe Mary can connect you. Mary, I was thinking to Skip, that's a chair of the DLAC advocacy committee, to have that conversation, because I think it would be great to have another Red Cross voice and someone who's really passionate about it.
Sounds like a plan. Great. Laura, did you have a response for that, or should we, on my side, Laura's frozen.
Laura looks to be frozen. They've had
Laura had to
communities in
drop off.
Louisiana that have been hit multiple times.
Okay,
Mary,
so,
Laura had to drop off.
okay,
And the next question's from Scott.
great, thank you.
Yeah, I am a DAT duty officer in Idaho, Montana, and Eastern Oregon. And a lot of times when I do recovery work in RC care, are a lot of these legal things put on, it used to be Aunt Bertha, and now we use findhelp.org. I just wondered if that was kind of put on there so when we do the recovery, that we could use that resource.
And you can, Scott, that's the, if the local legal aid has posted their information in Find Help, then yes, that's a resource. If there is nothing that you can find, that's where you can contact me, Patty Higginbotham, or mobilize at redcross.org, and we can connect you with legal aid offices in your area.
Yeah, that would be great if you could do that, because I think, yeah, we're kind of a rural area, but, we just had a fire that affected 25 homes, and we're still having wildfires, and, we have 60 clients that were evacuated yesterday. And so, yeah, we've got some fairly big non-DRO incidents.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yep. So just feel free to email us and we'll do what we can to get you connected.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tina, you're up.
Yes, hi, thank you. I reside in the USVI, so this is a territory, and we're fairly rural as well. And as a Red Cross staff member, I haven't really thought about the legal aspect of disaster. So I'm very, attending this session has really educated me. I'm not sure what resources are available in my community, but I definitely will be looking, making contact with the local legal aid offices, and Mary, I probably will be sending an email, to try to get some resources. We still have, remnants of damage from Hurricane Maria and Irma way back in 2017. And, so there are a lot of folks felt that they didn't get a lot of support from FEMA. And with people not really knowing what steps to take, they just accept that, well, I was denied, and they just try to move on as best they can. So, I'm glad to be aware of this avenue for further assistance for people who have a great need. Thank you.
Well, and just to add on to what you're saying right now, I know that not every rural area has a legal aid, and that is a problem. And that's something that, we're trying to address on a state level at this point, which may or may not help, right? Territories included. But there may be more simplistic things we can do. Like, for example, with the FEMA piece, I specialize in FEMA. People call me an expert. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but the reality is it really isn't that difficult. It's just about knowing what to do and feeling confident enough to do it. So if it's something that you can help with, or you can connect to DCMs or disaster case managers with, or, other entities or agencies that might be quasi-legal, it's something that could be accomplished, and we're happy to do that. Mary's happy to help coordinate, a training or something like that, because I really do believe that, FEMA is like the initial block. It's the initial problem, and because of the way that it unfolds, so many people are rejected outright because they have insurance or they have title problems. It doesn't matter if they lawfully own the home or if they're severely underinsured and their insurance might as well be a joke because it doesn't cover anything, right? Or there's a huge deductible or write-off, that we need to get over that hurdle. We need to get especially vulnerable peoples over that hurdle. So if it could help to, hopefully there's someone on the ground that can help there. But if not, I think there's a training opportunity there. So keep that in mind.
Elisa, would you like to ask your 3 questions?
Yeah, I had some specific questions for you, Kendall. I put them in the chat. So the first one is, do you use a tracking system like CAN, to make sure that you and the other organizations that you're involving are keeping track that you're not, duplicating any services, etc. The second question is, how do you handle or reach or serve English as a second language clients? And the third question is, the education that DLAC offers sounds awesome. I'm wondering how that works across state lines. So if you have an attorney who's licensed in one state but is offering education in another, how does the education work there across state lines? And you can attempt any one of these in any order.
Answer in any order. No. The tracking system that's used most broadly in California is the ETO system, and it's mostly because Catholic Charities is our largest provider for disaster case management care. So once someone invests in the cost of a system, it's kind of hard to get away from it. This has kind of become an issue in the past year, saying there are other, and actually a lot more since COVID, because of the necessity for remote work. There are other software programs that are less expensive and sometimes some people say more accessible, but there's been kind of a need to pull back on that, at least for the moment, because Catholic Charities basically covers all of the areas here. I will say that on an individual basis, we all internally track our cases, right? So like we have something we use called Legal Server, but what we try and do in theory is to work with the disaster case manager to make sure that there's knowledge of what we are doing. So if that makes sense, and California actually just got a very large grant to do wraparound service care in general. So this may change in the next year or two. Fingers crossed. So CVOs all over will have access to it, and it won't just be, you know, one place. And I know California is not the only state that's done that. That's been something that has been really pushed broadly, and it's federal funding that is trickling down.
So what was the name of it again? ESO?
ETO.
ETO.
Mm-hmm. And then for the second, the ESL client piece, in California, our largest secondary language is Spanish. However, because we're in a relatively rural area, that does not mean that people speak the same level of language, whether that be from an educational standpoint or be from sort of an indigenous population standpoint. So that's been something that we've really had to address. It's had to remain a focal point. There has been a huge push for equity as well in California, so it's made it a little bit easier. I will say there are generally a lot of, you know, pro bono attorneys that are willing to volunteer to translate things, to be present if there isn't someone within your own organization that knows the language in question. The biggest challenge I've really seen there is identifying what the language is prior to actually, you know, meeting with a person. Like if you don't know the language, then there's an assumption being made, right? So we use a language hotline that is national and it's helpful. It's generally not that expensive. You guys might even have it. Mary would know that. But basically, you can ask this person to call this number, and that number can then, or you can call it. If someone calls you and you don't know what language they're speaking, you can call the line and say, I have this person, I cannot communicate with them effectively, and they'll find out the language. It just takes a little bit of patience, but the feedback we've been given from it is that people in that circumstance that don't speak English as the first language and don't speak another maybe primary language in the area where there would be an assumption that of course people would speak it, that they're kind of familiar with the, if I call in and the person's going to be helpful, right, that there might be a minute that they need to wait to figure out what's going on. So I would definitely recommend trying to use systems like that. And all of our online, like DLAC hotline and stuff, that is translated into 12 different languages currently. I will say it's always a challenge to translate materials because they need to be not just translated into accessible languages, but also it really no higher than a 5th or 6th grade education to be really meaningfully accessible. So that's been a little more challenging because oftentimes the, you know, translator is like very well educated. So they're, you know, you feel like you're back in college where they're like speaking to you as a professor and you're like, wait a minute, that's not going to be helpful. I don't even know what you mean. So, you know, how does anybody else? So you kind of have to be careful about who you use, or just be really, really clear that we want this to be like a conversation piece. Like, don't feel it needs to be apples to apples, where like if it says this in English, say it in this language, right? Maybe it makes no sense to use the same words, you know? So it's something to, unfortunately, we're trying to do better at, but. And then your third was state lines. Oh, if people want to volunteer, well, attorneys unfortunately they only get a license for any state that they're in. So if you're licensed in California, you can only work in California without having a secondary attorney oversee you. So there's sort of two options. Myself, I'm also federally licensed, which doesn't mean I can work in every state, but it does mean that I can deal with federal issues. So like FEMA doesn't become an issue. That's something I could deal with anywhere. But like insurance in another state, I couldn't. However, if there was a local attorney that was willing to oversee a group of volunteer attorneys, they, generally speaking, sometimes this could vary depending on the local rules, but generally and most commonly, we could say, you know, okay, there's this place in rural Idaho and they need help and they don't have attorneys, but there's one attorney that's willing to oversee a group of attorneys. So in theory, we could bring attorneys there, you know, remotely or literally. And as long as that attorney is willing to sort of take responsibility for the supervision of the volunteers, it's generally okay. And especially because there are these sort of strange disaster rules that really prioritize disaster response. That in case of an emergency, a disaster, you know, it's commonly thought of as like if someone's on their deathbed, you know, we don't really care where the attorney's from. We care that that person gets the legal help they need to like write their will. However, the same is true, and it's been broadly construed in recent years when there are areas that there just is not enough legal support in. So I say, if you run up against that, be creative. You know, obviously we'd want to talk to the local bar, but it's definitely something worth pursuing. And a very good question.
Okay, this has been an amazing conversation and presentation. We have 2 more questions and then we're going to wrap up and close out. The first question is, how frequently do landlords take advantage of disaster situations to attempt to illegally evict renters? And what are the resources and/or support can a local legal aid provide to these renters?
So that's a great question. All the time. I'm shocked at that. I remember in the 2017 fires watching on the news, and we heard all these stories that people were looting people's homes while people were fleeing for their lives. And I remember thinking that was so insane, because if you're not that kind of person, it doesn't even cross your mind that that sounds like a good idea, right? So the shock that comes with the disaster when you initially kind of go through that is pretty real. And eviction is one of those things where you're like, why would people evict someone that, you know, are being displaced or, you know, whatnot? But the reality is disasters bring in a lot of money into a certain area, whether that's federal funds or, you know, it's insurance money, or it's a combination of both, or even if it's, you know, donations and things, that there ends up being this reality where people try and take advantage of it. So you see that with rental prices, quite frankly, and the cost of rental skyrocket. So if someone is not literally, like, let's say their rental unit wasn't impacted by the disaster itself, like the rental unit's still there, but the rest of the community was impacted, suddenly that landlord thinks, okay, well, I can charge, you know, 3 times more for rent here. So if I can get this tenant out, then I can bring someone else in and make a ton more money. And the interesting thing is most states have anti-price gouging statutes. So it's illegal to increase the rent more than 10%. But most landlords don't know this or don't care. I will say that fortunately, the majority we have run into just don't know it. And they think that they're just making a business decision. They're not looking at the significant impact on the household. However, it's really important to understand if the state that you're in has an anti-price gouging statute, because once there's been a disaster declared in your state, it doesn't even necessarily have to be in your specific county, but in your state, those protections could apply. And that means that they can't increase the rent by more than 10% most of the time. Some are 8, some are 12, but generally it's around 10%. So if you deal with a legal aid and you reach out to the landlord and say, hey, by the way, you're unlawfully attempting to evict my client, and if you're doing so because you're trying to increase the rent, you can be significantly fined, you can be criminally punished. You know, it's a crime as well as something that allows for civil remedies. So contacting your district attorney's office, you know, or the equivalent in the area, your city attorney, whatnot, and or reaching out to legal aid to see if there can be something done. Oftentimes there can.
All right, and last question. Can legal aid continue to help the victims from a disaster after their recovery, or is it just temporary when they are in the shelter? And I'll just, before you answer that, Kendall, I'll just say most of the legal aid help comes after people are out of shelters and in their recovery, and it can go on months and months. So Kendall, if you want to add to that, go right ahead.
Yeah, Mary's right. Basically, the trajectory of legal issues starts once people feel that they're at least potentially temporarily housed in a safe way. So we don't even hear about things in the first couple of days, sometimes in the first week, sometimes the first 3 or 4 weeks. It kind of depends on how severe the disaster is and how far people are displaced, etc. So their immediate needs are the thing that they first think about. And then secondarily, they're like, what do we do? Right. And that's kind of the piece where the legal needs come in, where, you know, of course we can help. And the trajectory may change depending on whatever the local legal aid program is funded for, meaning sometimes programs start and they're funded for a year, right? My program's been funded for 5 years, and we have 2.5 additional years of funding, maybe 3.5, that still exists. That's not necessarily common. Our program has done very well. So some programs will go away, but they generally wouldn't go away before FEMA goes away. And FEMA is there for a minimum of 18 months. That is often extended to 24 or at least 2022. So you should have funding that runs similar to that from a legal assistance standpoint.
All right, I think we're at time. People are dropping, they have to go. So thank you. I'm sure we could go on forever, but thank you so much, Kendall and Aliza and Laura. And we're getting great, just kudos in the chat. Thank you for such great information. So I think people got a lot out of this. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I will follow up tomorrow with some people on information. So thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Mary, for arranging. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.